Thanks, Diane. All right, I'm going to talk very fast because I have the subject of government overreach. And I think government overreach probably applies to every single topic we've got on the agenda this evening. So let's start with federal acquisition of land in New Hampshire. The Silvio Conti Wildlife Refuge is a federal wildlife refuge that extends from the Canadian border down to the shores of Connecticut. Currently, it has 36,000 acres in the wildlife refuge, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wants to expand that almost 6 times to about 200,000 acres. And on the face of it, a lot of people will hear that and they'll say, that sounds great. I like conservation. I like the outdoors. Isn't that a wonderful thing? So I want to talk about some problems with the expansion of the Silvio Conti Wildlife Refuge and several other wildlife refuges that are either expanding or being created here in New Hampshire. The first problem is with eminent domain. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has said that they're only going to be acquiring land from willing sellers. But they have also said that they believe eminent domain applies or could be applied in this situation to take land, and they will not rule out that they would use eminent domain. A second problem is, let's say they don't use eminent domain. If you like your land, you can keep your land. And, but all of the land surrounding your property is acquired by the federal government. If you access your land using a road that goes through federal land, the federal government might decide to shut down that road and shut down access to your property. So you may continue to own your property, you just won't be able to get to it. This has in fact happened in several western states, including Colorado and Utah, so it's not a far-fetched scenario. The third problem has to do with property taxes. So if the Fish and Wildlife Service has their way, 93 towns throughout New Hampshire would be affected by this. In fact, in some of those towns, over 50% of the land would be purchased under this plan. So if you're a property owner in that town and over 50% of your property tax base disappears because the federal government, which does not pay property taxes, has acquired that land, guess what's going to happen? Your property taxes are going up. The federal government does make some payments to towns, but it's typically 21 to 47% of what they've lost in property taxes. So this would have a major, major impact on towns in the affected area, particularly in the Connecticut Valley along the Vermont-New Hampshire border. Another problem is land use restrictions. The federal government has a pretty atrocious record when it comes to deciding what you as a New Hampshire resident can do on their land. So if this becomes federal land, there are a number of restrictions that could be put into place, including no snowmobiling, no hunting, no shooting, no ATVs, no picnicking. There's one wildlife refuge along the Maine border where people are not allowed to pick the blueberries. So, some of these sound minor, but the collective result is that somebody in Washington or a bureaucrat somewhere else decides what New Hampshire citizens can do in New Hampshire and not the people who live here. And that could be motivated by somebody who's, has extreme environmental views, or it could be somebody who has a political agenda and wants to reward politically connected donors with, let's say, timber harvesting contracts. This is what happens a lot out west. It could happen here if we don't put a stop to it. The final problem with federal land acquisition is that it violates state law. Since 1935, there has been a law on the books in New Hampshire prohibiting the federal government from acquiring more than 2% of the land in New Hampshire. The White Mountain National Forest is excluded from that, but other than that, it's a 2% limit. The federal government's current position is they don't have to obey that law. The Supremacy Clause essentially excludes them from having to obey that New Hampshire law. RSA 121, the law I just cited, also prohibits the federal government from acquiring more than 5% of the tax base for property in any one town. So if you see these towns where there's 10, 20, 30, 50% of the land or the tax base is going to be acquired by the federal government. That also violates this statute. There were two bills brought forth in the last legislative session that were intended to address this. The first bill was to require the state of New Hampshire to keep track of lands owned and controlled by the federal government in New Hampshire. And this would have the effect of at least having somewhere we could go and say, where are we on that scale of 2% or 5% for specific towns? That did not pass. The other bill would have required approval by the legislature and the executive council for all federal land acquisitions in New Hampshire. And I think that would really put the decision in the hands of the representatives of the people. That also did not pass. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the EPA and their MS4 program. Now this one is a federal issue, and as a state representative, there's probably going to be little or nothing that you can do about this one. But I'm bringing it up because it is so important. It's going to drive property taxes up all over New Hampshire, and people aren't going to know why. It's important that you understand what's going on with MS4. MS4 is a permitting process, but to call it a permit process is pretty deceptive. It's like getting a permit to breathe. I can't choose not to do it. And what the permitting process is allowing in this case is if you live in a town, if you are a town government, and rain falls on your town, and you allow that rain to run into a little rivulet, which eventually ends up in a bigger stream, which eventually ends up in a lake, which eventually ends up in a river and then an ocean, you need a permit for that. So the MS4 permitting process has a number of onerous requirements. Not all cities and towns are subject to it currently. Wilton, where I live, will be subject to MS4 starting in 2017. We have already paid about $100,000 to get ready to be compliant. And the EPA estimates that most cities and towns will pay between $70,000 and $700,000 per year to comply. So it's going to drive everybody's property taxes up. Here is some of what it requires. There are extensive reporting requirements. You have to send your town employees to mandatory trainings. You will have to hire engineers to certify your plan and oversee what you're doing to make sure that you are complying. There will be increased monitoring and testing. You will need to have street sweepers come in at least twice a year and sweep your town, sweep your streets. You will have to do education and outreach programs to teach citizens how to handle their pet waste and how to properly fertilize their lawns without causing pollution. You may need to do an annual leaf pickup, even if you live in a town where everybody rakes their leaves into the woods. You may need to do a curbside pickup of leaves once a year just to make sure everyone has that opportunity. And finally, this is the real zinger. Towns will need to change their land use regulations in order to conform with MS4. So this is what's coming from the EPA, and it's going to drive property taxes up. So one of the things you may hear is, why are my property taxes going up? There are a number of different causes. MS4 is going to be a real zinger. So look out for that. I think I have about 1 minute left, so I'm going to touch briefly on a couple of other topics. And just mention that these are in the handout that you're going to get. One of them, very hot topic, is immigration. Everybody says immigration is purely a federal issue. There's not much that we can do about it. The reality is that there are some things that, as a state, that we can do about it. We can deny in-state tuition to illegal immigrants. We can require the use of E-Verify by employers. That may be controversial to some. We could deny funding to sanctuary cities, and we could deny driver's license to illegal aliens. These are all things that have come up in the prior session. Civil forfeiture. The legislature made some reforms to civil forfeiture, civil asset forfeiture. This is where law enforcement can come in and seize your assets because although you may not be guilty of a crime, I believe that your car is guilty of a crime. And while you're innocent until proven guilty, your car is guilty until proven innocent, so we're going to take it. New Hampshire has made some strides in that area. There is a good article on a federal loophole that the state could help to close in the next session. And I think my time is up, so I'm going to end there.